So we have just a couple more speakers left before we get some Ben & Jerry's ice cream. We have another NYC Free Assange member, the polemicist, Jim Kavanaugh.
Hi, thanks for coming. Great to see everybody here. I was a founding member of the New York City Free Assange movement, and I can be found at my Substack. And you can hear me often on the radio with Garland Nixon and Wilma Leon, John Kiriakou. Julian Assange's release was certainly a real ray of hope in what is otherwise a dark and dangerous world now. As someone who helped found New York City Free Assange, who wrote 2 long articles arguing his case, participated in many talk shows about it, and was on the street with Chuck and Bernadette and Marty and in the cold and the heat, I was especially pleased to see this happen. It was a rare and welcome success for progressive activism that we should all celebrate and be proud of. It's okay for us to be a little self-satisfied about this and pat ourselves on the back. Always good to be able to pat yourself on the back. We made a positive difference. It may not have been the only thing or the deciding thing, but it was a positive difference that we made. The millions of people, as people said, around the world who were out there over the years. When we were out, I just can't, how as Chuck and Margaret said, people didn't know what we were talking about. You know, you're out there on the street, you have to educate people who didn't even know the name Julian Assange was. And we did make a difference. Recognizing all that, we also have to recognize that the achievement of Julian's freedom is tinged by the unfortunate reality of the plea deal that effected it. I certainly support Julian's accepting that plea because factually and legally, he's only admitting to what he actually did, which was, per the language of the plea, per the language of the plea, this is the charge that he was convicted of, obtained, that he was not convicted of, he pled guilty to, there is a difference. What he did was, quote, obtain documents, writings, and notes connected with the national defense and willfully communicate documents relating to the national defense classified at the secret level. That's what he did, and he didn't have a defense against it, a traditional defense. As Stella Assange has said, Julian pled guilty to being a journalist, to doing journalism. Julian had no possibility of avoiding a much harsher sentence. As John Kiriakou has said, because he knows, you could not get a fair trial in the Eastern District of Virginia, and he was not going to make wasn't going to be allowed to make a public defense argument, or certainly any kind of jury nullification argument. I also note that the plea agreement stipulated, quote, that Julian, quote, shall take all action within his control, to cause the return to the United States of any such unpublished information in his possession, custody, or control, or that of WikiLeaks or any affiliate of WikiLeaks. So that's an interesting part of the plea agreement that I don't really know that much about. Julian has every right now to enjoy his private life with his family. He's recovering, after all, from the effects, really serious, as people have said, nearly suicide-causing effects of 12 years of involuntary detainment. But I do hope that someday soon we hear directly from him about these concerns, and I don't know if WikiLeaks has something to say about them. But taking a step back, we have to recognize that the US governments and whatever you want to call it, the deep state censorship complex, got, if not all 175 years they wanted, practically everything they needed from the persecution of Julian Assange. It got Julian's de facto incarceration for 12 years. It got the cooperation of foreign governments in applying American law extraterritorially. And most importantly, it got the precedent of a guilty plea for doing journalism under the Espionage Act, which I think effectively establishes an Official Secrets Act in the United States for the first time. There's no investigative reporter covering America's actions in the world and dealing with classified information who now cannot pause and have second or third thoughts about how far they're willing to go to express the truth. Julian was a harbinger. There is now a more widespread, internationalized as well as Americanized censorship offensive throughout the Euro-American world. And I want first to notice the fact, we should all notice the fact, that the ostensible, principled commitment to free speech, freedom of the press, and freedom of expression, which was used effectively because those things are poles of attraction to people, which was used effectively to great political effect as a fundamental mark of the superiority of the Western capitalist versus the communist world, has that so-called commitment has, since the demise of Soviet communism, steadily disappeared. And it's now being replaced with aggressive hostility to the principles of free speech, freedom of the press, and freedom of expression. In other words, the Western world's commitment to free speech was always an instrument, not a principle. And this is astounding to see. I've lived through a long time of it, and to see the reversal is quite stark and incontrovertible. The Assange persecution was not just against Julian personally, it was also against the institution of WikiLeaks, because that was a venue that was free from governmental and traditional media gatekeeping processes, and that provided new trusted channels of protection for whistleblowers and transparency for the public. The Assange persecution was an attack against any such institution. And over the past dozen years, we've seen a new, richly articulated and increasingly aggressive apparatus of censorship and repression that has risen and been built up to put a stop to all of that by attacking and controlling the certainly less committed, but still too dangerously ungated apparatuses of social media and independent publishing. Call it international, transnational, globalist, or whatever you want. I would say the purpose of this censorship apparatus is to reestablish secure gatekeeping of all forms of media, whose purpose is to protect the indispensable ideological and political economic hegemony, but the ideological hegemony of US-dominated capitalism, imperialism, and Zionism. Their strategy on this is very clear and very smart. Pick on and amplify various superficially plausible or simply made up nasty characterizations to set people against each other, so that we'll argue about who actually deserves to be censored, harassed, tried, monetized, debanked, or imprisoned. Julian Assange is a smelly cat rapist. Alex Jones is a loudmouth conspiracy theorist. January 6 protesters are insurrectionists. Cop City protesters are domestic terrorists. The Uhuru 3 and Scott Ritter and Danny Shaw and Dan Kovalik and African Stream are foreign agents. Telegram and TikTok are tools of Russia or China. Pro-Palestinian student protesters are anti-Semites. This is where we're at now, and it's going to get worse. It will be a mistake for leftists not to resist when this happens to people we don't like. It's going to get worse for anyone who dissents from the establishment narrative of Putin's perfidy against Ukraine, or the perfection of the American electoral system, or China's aggression against its own province of Taiwan, etc. As far as the establishment is concerned, we are in a state of war against Russia in one theater and against Iran and the Palestinian people in another, and soon against China. And for them, that necessitates wartime censorship. In this context, I like to say that American and European polities have been reconfigured into what the French theorist Etienne Balibar called the state of preemptive counter-revolution. Unfortunately, there is no revolutionary movement, but there is a pre-revolutionary socioeconomic and geopolitical and ideological crisis. So the European and American states are reconstituting themselves as counter-revolutionary regimes, establishing fascistic counter-revolutionary policies and stoking diversionary cultural and identitarian conflicts to defeat a revolutionary opposition by preventing its emergence, ironically, in the name of anti-fascism. So I'll say again, this is going to get worse, most immediately and especially regarding the sanctity of Zionism and Israel and the diabolical perniciousness of Iran and the Palestinian resistance. It's going to get worse precisely because of the surprisingly quick and thorough way in which the Zionist narrative has been undermined, and indeed, as I argued in a recent essay, a real and unprecedented anti-Zionist discourse has taken hold in this country in the past 11 months. The entire spectrum of the ruling class in the US and Europe will do anything to stop that. Kamala says free speech is a privilege. Hillary says misinformation should be criminalized. Trump says we have to close the internet in some ways. Despite some silly hopium, there's no free speech warrior in this election. All the people across the duopoly are motivated to aggressively censor anti-Zionism. They are going to pressure universities to crack down on anti-Zionism as anti-Semitism. On pro-Palestinian students will be at risk of losing their education. Anti-Zionists will be banished from social media. States and federal government will forbid payments to anyone who protests Israel or refuses to accept the legitimacy of the Zionist project. The French example, which we have now, of refusing to accept the result of an election that hints of any faction with less than complete support for Israel and Zionism coming into the government will spread. The Digital Services Act in Europe and all the disinformation governance nonsense and the spate of legislation adopting the IHR definition of anti-Semitism and using it to defund and ultimately criminalize all anti-Zionist activity will spread. These initiatives are part of a unified global campaign of preemptive counter-revolutionary censorship and repression. So in short, what I want to say is Julian Assange is free, but speech isn't. The press isn't. Expression isn't. It's under more threat than it has been for a century in this country. And the internationalized extraterritorial application of American law that we saw in the Assange case has now become an internationalized censorship regime that is subsuming what was the unique protection of the First Amendment in this country. Richard Medhurst, Sarah Wilkinson, C.J. Hopkins, Ali Abunimah are the international co-defendants of Scott Ritter, Chairman O'Malley, Danny Shaw, Dan Kovalik, and Julian Assange. So we can take a measure of self-satisfaction in what we achieved in helping to free Julian Assange, and we should. But I'm afraid, in the words of that great American drummer, we've only just begun.